War tends to highlight the worst in people, as seen in the many acts of desperation, anger, fear, and cruelty punctuated and exhibited throughout all major hostilities. All sides of armed conflict can and do commit atrocious acts against their enemies, whether they are civilian or military. And even though there are laws of conduct and processes for how wars are fought, these regulations are frequently violated. In the European theater of the Second World War, crimes against humanity, cruelty, torture, and murder were all committed against military personnel and civilians alike, despite the national government's laws and international policies set in the Geneva Conventions forbidding such conduct. The Soviet army was notorious for its brutality, and the resistance groups were not bound by the same laws as their military counterparts. Although the Nazi regime was infamous for executing prisoners of war, particularly Soviet POWs, there is plenty of evidence there were reciprocal slayings of German detainees by partisan resistance groups, as well as Soviet and Allied forces. Welcome to History Decoded. And today, we will take a look at the shocking executions of Nazi prisoners of war during World War II. An eye for an eye. Resistance members enact their revenge. While many factions were supported by the Allies, the underground resistance groups across occupied Europe were made up of a mix of both civilian and military personnel who functioned under a mutual goal of freeing their nation from German rule. These organizations were independent cells working to undermine the Nazi invasion and subjugation of their respective homelands, but were mostly untethered from each other or associated with each other in the ultimate goal of re-establishing independence. An example of this could be as such. A Parisian resistance movement group could have contacts with the Special Operations Executive in Britain and pass information from Allied to the Lyon branch to keep them up to date on the upcoming D-Day invasion. The Lyon group could have more communists in its ranks than that of the Parisian resistance, who were more aligned with the democratic ideals of pre-occupied France. While they may have different ideals, their fundamental standards were the same: fight and depose the German occupiers in France to re-establish a free and independent France. Of these organizations, the resistance factions in Europe were focused on the destruction and undermining of the German occupation of their lands. Sabotaging German and assassinations of Nazi officers, soldiers, administrators, collaborators, and sympathizers took place all over the continent. After the D-Day invasion, factions of the French resistance helped the Allies take on the Germans and in some cases, helped to eliminate them. Collaborators and German soldiers taken by the resistance were, rather than being taken to a rebel hideout or Allied camp for processing, instead executed and buried quickly. Many were afraid of retaliation since they did not have prisons to hold the Germans, but other partisans were happy to exact revenge on enemy forces through swift, harsh justice. In recent years, some former resistance members admitted to taking part in the executions of German soldiers who had surrendered to them. In a small, wooded area near and southwest central town of Meymac, France, resistance members took one female collaborator and 47 German POWs and forced them to dig. After the small graves were established, resistance members went to each one and, one by one, shot the prisoners in the head. The bodies were covered in quicklime and then swiftly buried. This has yet to be officially corroborated by other participants of the resistance, most of whom are dead, or archaeological evidence. 11 German bodies were recovered in the small hamlet of Le Vert near Meymac in 1967, but as for the other 36 soldiers and one female associate said to have been killed by the partisans in this incident, they have yet to be found. Retaliatory violence by the Germans against civilians following the assault or death of a Nazi soldier was especially common and very costly for the French partisans who suffered heavy losses during the war. Many members of the resistance enacted revenge for the deaths of their countrymen and the deportation of comrades to the concentration camps by killing German prisoners. The number of German POWs who had surrendered to the resistance in France is not explicitly known. It is not known how many Nazi soldiers or their collaborators were killed by the partisan forces, since many of the mass execution sites or burial grounds have yet to be found or revealed. Vengeance for fallen countrymen. Allied executions of POWs. Despite the rules of war prohibiting the execution of prisoners of war, there were plenty of instances during World War II where POWs were killed while in custody of enemy forces. The Germans are believed to have killed between 5 and 6 million Soviet prisoners of war in mass hangings or shootings, or from starvation, disease, or the gas chambers while being held at the concentration camps. The Germans saw the Soviets as less than human, and were therefore to be discarded with the same depravity and viciousness as the other quote-unquote undesirables portrayed by the Nazi regime, such as Jews, Poles, and Romani. The Soviet forces were equally well known for their brutality against their enemies, such as the mass executions of Polish POWs at Katyn in 1940. The Germans, following the invasion of Russia in the summer of 1941, were unable to crush the Russian resistance and were eventually routed, forced to flee. The Soviet army pursued them with the full intention of slaughtering as many Germans as they could in the process. At the end of 1942, Soviet troops retook Feodosia in the Crimea from the retreating Germans and found 160 German wounded in the military hospitals, having been abandoned by their Wehrmacht comrades. Instead of treating the captives or transferring them to Soviet prison camps, the POWs were killed. Some died quickly, being shot in their beds. Others were less fortunate and were tossed off the roof of the hospital building or beaten to death. Some endured a terrible fate, being drenched in water and forced to stand in the cold until they eventually succumbed to hypothermia. These killings of German prisoners of war were but the start of the Soviet attacks to avenge their countrymen, and became synonymous with Russian justice against the Nazis. Like the Soviets, there were several instances where American soldiers took part in the execution of German prisoners of war, although the number of slayings were significantly less compared to the events perpetrated by their Soviet allies. The majority of notable incidents of American killings of POWs took place following the D-Day invasions, although similar occurrences took place during the liberation of fascist Italy in 1943. One of the more ill-reputed episodes of the execution of German POWs by the Americans was the Chenogne Massacre, which took place in Belgium on New Year's Day, 1945. During the Battle of Bastogne, in the small neighboring village of Chenogne, a number of soldiers in the U.S. 11th Armored Division received orders not to take any prisoners. As they cleared the village of German soldiers, around 20 Wehrmacht soldiers were found taking refuge in cellars and attics. They immediately tried to surrender to the Americans, but were instead ripped out of their hiding spots, taken into the snowy street, and were shot. Another 60 Germans were captured and then taken to a neighboring field where they also were killed. Despite this being a clear violation of the Geneva Convention regarding handling surrendering combatants, no American soldier was ever brought up on charges of committing a war crime. The U.S. 11th Armored Division even received support from General George S. Patton, despite future President General Dwight D. Eisenhower ordering an investigation of the events. The massacre at Chenogne was clearly a retaliatory execution of Nazi prisoners of war, which was to get revenge for the Malmedy butchery of American soldiers by the Waffen-SS a couple of weeks prior. Horrors of the Holocaust. The executions of Nazis at Dachau by American soldiers. The most infamous execution of German prisoners of war occurred during the liberation of Dachau concentration camp. Dachau was one of the first camps founded by the Nazi regime, built in 1933 and originally operating as a labor camp to hold opponents of the state near Munich, Germany before transitioning into serving as a horrific place, a location to imprison Germany's enemies, including political prisoners, homosexuals, foreign nationals, communists, Soviets, partisans, Jews, Romani, and criminals. It is estimated that at least 4,500 were killed there during its operation from 1933 to 1945, although the exact number is not known. By the spring of 1945, many of the concentration camps had already been liberated by the Allies or abandoned by the Germans, who also destroyed a vast amount of information and data from the camps. Many prisoners were executed prior to the German departure or were moved to another camp deeper into Germany. American soldiers arrived at Dachau in late April 1945 and found thousands of starving and sick inmates being supervised by a handful of German soldiers. The skeletal survivors embraced their rescuers and tried to explain what they had endured. The German soldiers who had been overseeing the camp quickly surrendered to the Americans and expected to be transferred to Allied prisoner of war camps. This would not be their fate. The stench of death and decay hung over the camp, and the sight of the survivors were not only shocking but also horrific. The Americans were disgusted by the state of the inmates, who were so skeletal and sick Many could not stand up to thank their saviors. The soldiers found victims stuffed into overcrowded train cars and barracks, a handful forced try and stay alive among the dead that were piled on top of one another like cordwood. Thousands of naked, twisted bodies, some strewn across the grounds of the camp, while others were half buried or left near the crematorium, were discovered, and mass graves were shown to the soldiers. The Americans were enraged, and as more details of the beatings, starvations, executions, and tortures the inmates had endured came to light, revenge became the moral obligation of the liberators. The 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, were one of the battalions who helped to liberate the camp. The surrendering SS and Wehrmacht soldiers were moved to one of the buildings near the hospital and, when Sparks was not present, heard one of the Americans yell that the Germans were making a break for it, trying to escape. The blast of machine gun fire followed, and by the time Sparks ran back to where the POWs were being held, he saw 12 dead and numerous wounded Nazis on the ground, and a weeping American soldier standing nearby. It is not known if the soldier was telling the truth of the Germans trying to escape, or, overcome by the horrors of the concentration camp, he had enacted vengeance on the German soldiers. There were other accounts and incidents at Dachau, but it is not known how accurate these numbers are as to how many Nazi soldiers were killed, ranging between 15 and 50 according to other witnesses. Investigations were held to look into the executions, but all charges were dropped, and the focus of caring for the survivors and prosecuting the perpetrators of the Holocaust became paramount. Humans will always find a way to do awful things to one another, and at the height of war, the line of morality is frequently blurred, especially with the growing tensions between sides are exploited. After 6 years of battles, invasions, raids, massacres, and bombings, it's not surprising that by the end of World War II, there were several instances of mass executions of Nazi prisoners of war at the hands of resistance members and Allied soldiers. Many of these slayings were a direct result of German crimes against POWs, civilians, and military personnel over the course of the Second World War II, and were just as brutal and swift as had been carried out by the Germans. While some may argue that one act of violence cannot forgive or even the score, and are still criminal acts, many viewed the deaths of German POWs as cathartic for the Soviets and Allies, and helped end the war. Thank you for watching our video, The Executions of Nazi Prisoners of War, here on History Decoded. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Feel free to leave a comment below about other topics we should cover. Thank you again, and until next time, this is History Decoded.